A piercing cry cuts through a Colorado blizzard, where a young widow, Abigail Monroe, battles to bring her child into a world that's already taken her husband. Alone in the unforgiving mountains of 1873, her strength falters. But a shadowed figure, an exiled Apache warrior named Naiche, watches, torn between solitude and salvation. Their paths collide in a storm of loss and courage, forging a bond that defies prejudice and danger. Will their fragile trust withstand the threats lurking beyond the snow? Subscribe now to uncover their extraordinary journey and share where you're listening from. Can love triumph in a land divided by hate? Stay tuned to find out. Snow clawed at Abigail Monroe's face like 1,000 tiny knives, each flake a shard of ice in the Colorado dark. The winter of 1873 had no mercy, and neither did the mountain night. She was 20, widowed 3 months, her world shattered when Thomas fell to a bullet in a Silvertown brawl, pinned on Apaches for a horse theft he never committed. Now, alone on this frozen slope, her body betrayed her with a pain that split her in two. The baby was coming. Too soon, too fierce. Right here, 100 yards from her cabin's faint glow. Her hands, raw from chopping firewood, gripped the axe handle as another contraction tore through her. The bundle of sticks she'd gathered scattered across the snow, snapping like brittle bones under the storm's howl. "No, damn it. Not now," she hissed, her breath a white plume against the black sky. The wind swallowed her words, mocking her with its scream. She stumbled, boots sinking into the deepening drift, her swollen belly a weight pulling her toward the earth. The cabin was a distant promise, its chimney smoke curling like a ghost against the blizzard's wrath. Abigail's knees buckled, and she collapsed against the rough bark of a fallen pine. Pain came in waves now, relentless, each one closer than the last. She'd helped birth babies back in Pine Ridge, seen women grit their teeth through labor, but this was different. No midwife, no neighbor, just her and the storm, and death waiting in the shadows. Her shawl, threadbare and damp, did little to shield her from the cold that bit into her bones. She fumbled for the small knife at her belt, its blade glinting in the storm's gray half-light. "You and me, little one," she whispered to her belly, voice cracking. "We're doing this." The forest stood silent, save for the wind's wail and her ragged gasps. Somewhere above, eyes watched. Naiche, an Apache warrior cast out by his people, crouched in the pines, his silhouette swallowed by the night. 7 years of exile had honed his instincts, made him a ghost in these mountains. He'd been tracking the storm's path when he spotted her, a lone white woman, heavy with child, defying the blizzard for firewood. Her cries now echoed through the trees, sharp and desperate, pulling at something he'd buried long ago. He stayed hidden, as always, but his hands tightened on his bow, torn between solitude and the call of her pain. Abigail's world narrowed to the pulse of agony and the faint warmth of her own blood seeping into the snow. Thomas's face flashed in her mind. 19, all dreams and grit, promising her a life in these mountains before a miner's bullet stole him. "You wanted this baby," she gasped, as if he could hear her through the storm. Another contraction hit, and she bore down, teeth gritted, her scream lost in the wind's roar. The baby's head crowned, a searing pressure that threatened to break her. She clawed at the log, splinters biting her palms, and pushed with everything she had. The infant slipped into her trembling hands, a tiny, slick form in the snow's dim glow. Silence gripped the moment, heavier than the storm. Then a cry, small, fierce, piercing the night. "Mason," Abigail sobbed, pulling the boy to her chest. She tore at her petticoat, cleaning him with shaking hands, wrapping him in her shawl. The cord, cut with her knife, fell away like a severed tie to her old life. But the storm didn't care. Snow fell thicker, sideways now, and Mason's cries grew faint, his warmth fading against her. She staggered to her feet, legs like wet rope, the cabin her only hope. Each step was a battle, her body screaming, but Mason's life fueled her. Naiche moved through the trees, shadow to her struggle, his heart pounding against 7 years of isolation. He'd seen warriors falter under less. This woman's fight stirred memories of his mother, who died shielding their village. If Abigail fell, he'd break his vow of solitude. The storm raged, burying the world in white, but she kept moving, driven by a mother's fire. The cabin's door loomed ahead, a faint outline in the blizzard's chaos. Abigail stumbled inside, collapsing by the hearth, and Mason clutched tight. The warmth hit her like a fist, and she looked down at her son's tiny face, love burning fiercer than the storm outside. Naiche's breath hung in the frozen air, a faint ghost against the pine's dark spines. The blizzard of 1873 roared on, burying the Colorado mountains in a white shroud, but his eyes stayed fixed on the cabin below, where Abigail Monroe had just fought death to bring her son into the world. Her strength, raw and unyielding, had cracked something in him. A wall built over 7 years of exile, of living like a shadow among these peaks. He crouched low, his buckskin cloak blending with the snow-dusted branches, every instinct honed by solitude, screaming to stay hidden. Yet the echo of that newborn's cry, sharp as a hawk's call, pulled at him like a rope. He'd seen her before, this white woman, weeks ago, hauling water from the creek, her belly round under a patched coat. She moved with a stubborn grit that reminded him of his mother, who'd stood against raiders with nothing but a skinning knife. Naiche, cast out by his Apache kin for refusing to slaughter settlers, had learned to watch without being seen. But tonight, Abigail's struggle had drawn him closer, her pain a mirror to the grief he carried. His sister, dead of fever at 15 winters, her infant son lost with her. That memory burned, a coal in his chest, as he tracked Abigail's faltering steps to the cabin. The wind howled, spitting snow into his face, but Naiche's gaze never wavered. Inside, Abigail cradled her boy. Mason, she'd called him, her hands trembling as she tucked him against her chest. The firelight flickered through the cabin's single window, painting her face in gold and shadow. She was alive. The child was alive. But the storm wasn't done with them. Naiche knew these mountains. Blizzards like this could trap a soul for days, maybe weeks. And the boy's cries, though fierce at first, now sounded thin, fragile, like a reed bending in the gale. He shifted, snow crunching under his moccasins, and checked his medicine pouch. Willow bark, pine needles, herbs gathered from high ridges. His people's ways, learned from a healer before the elders branded him a traitor, could ease a fever, clear a child's lungs. But to help meant stepping into her world, risking the hate that followed an Apache in settler lands. 7 years ago, he'd chosen loneliness over blood, refusing to raid cabins like hers. Now, her courage mocked his isolation, daring him to act. Abigail rocked Mason by the fire, her own exhaustion a heavy chain. The warmth of the hearth fought the cold seeping through the cabin's chinks, but her son's breathing worried her. It was too fast, too shallow. She pressed a hand to his tiny forehead, praying the heat she felt was just the fire's glow. "Hold on, little man," she whispered, her voice rough as gravel. Thomas's absence ached like a fresh wound. His laugh, his dreams of silver veins, all gone to a miner's lie and a bullet. She'd survived that loss, but losing Mason would break her. Naiche's shadow moved closer, silent as a cougar. He'd seen death take children before. His sister's boy, blue-lipped and still, despite the healer's chants. The memory drove him now, his feet carrying him down the slope before his mind could argue. He stopped just beyond the cabin's clearing, where snow piled against the walls like a siege. Abigail's silhouette swayed inside, her strength fading. He could leave, vanish into the storm as he always had, but the boy's weakening cries rooted him to the spot. He knocked, a soft rap against the weathered door. Abigail froze, her hand flying to Thomas's old rifle above the mantel. "Who's there?" she called, her voice sharp despite the tremble. Naiche's English, rusty from disuse, came low and careful. "I helped the baby. Sick." The words felt foreign, heavy with risk. He waited, heart pounding like a war drum, as the door creaked open. Abigail stood there, Mason limp in her arms, her eyes wide with fear and defiance. She didn't scream, didn't shoot, but the rifle stayed leveled at his chest. "You watched me," she said, her voice cutting through the wind. "During the birth." Naiche nodded, his dark eyes steady. "You're strong. Baby strong. But now sick." He opened his pouch, showing her the herbs, their earthy scent sharp in the cold. Medicine. For fever. For breathing. Abigail's gaze darted to Mason, his tiny chest struggling. She was out of choices, caught between a mother's terror and a stranger's promise. "If you hurt him," she warned, her grip tightening on the rifle. Naiche's voice softened, carrying the weight of his own losses. "Never, children. Never." She stepped aside, letting him cross the threshold. The cabin's warmth hit him like a wave, the fire's crackle a stark contrast to the storm's roar. Naiche knelt by Mason, his hand steady as he examined the boy without touching, noting the flush of fever, the rattle in his breath. "Willow bark first," he said, already grinding the herbs with a stone. Abigail watched, her fear warring with hope, as this Apache, this supposed enemy, worked to save her son. Outside, the blizzard buried the world, but inside, two souls, scarred by loss and bound by a child's life, took their first step toward trust. The cabin's fire cast long shadows across the rough-hewn walls, a fragile bulwark against the Colorado blizzard's relentless assault. Naiche's hands, steady as granite, ground willow bark into a fine powder, the earthy scent mingling with the smoke. Abigail's eyes, sharp with a mother's fear, tracked his every move, her rifle now propped against the wall, but close enough to grab. Mason's fevered whimpers filled the small space, each one a knife in her chest. The storm of 1873 howled outside, sealing them in this moment. Two strangers, bound by a child's fading breath, teetering on the edge of trust. Naiche worked with the precision of a man who'd learned healing through loss. His sister's death, her infant gone with her, had driven him to study with the Apache healer, memorizing the secrets of herbs under starlit skies. Now, he steeped the willow bark in a tin cup over the fire, the steam rising like a prayer. "Small sips," he said, his voice low, English halting but clear. "Too much, baby, worse." Abigail nodded, her hands cradling Mason, whose tiny body burned against her. She'd heard tales of Apache savagery, of raids that left cabins smoldering, but this man's eyes held no threat, only a quiet grief that mirrored her own. She dipped a cloth in the cooling tea, coaxing drops into Mason's mouth. He fussed, his lips pursing, but Naiche's steady presence calmed her trembling hands. "He fight," Naiche said, a faint approval in his tone. "Like you." Abigail's throat tightened. Thomas had called her stubborn, his grin bright as a summer creek when she'd insisted on learning to shoot his rifle. That life felt a lifetime ago, stolen by a miner's lie and a bullet. Now, she was trusting an Apache, a man her people would shoot on sight, to save her son. The fire popped, sending sparks up the chimney as the storm battered the cabin. Naiche sat back, his buckskin shirt taut across shoulders that bore the weight of 7 years alone. He'd spoken to no one in 2 winters, his voice rusty from silence, but Abigail's questions came anyway. "Why help us?" she asked, her voice rough as the pine boards underfoot. Naiche's hand stilled on his medicine pouch, his dark eyes catching the firelight. "You fight for baby, like my mother. She'd die for village." His words carried the weight of old wounds, and Abigail saw it, the same hollow ache she felt for Thomas. She shifted Mason, his breathing easing slightly, and met Naiche's gaze. "Thomas was framed," she said, the words spilling out like stones. "Miners said he stole horses, blamed Apaches to cover their tracks, shot him dead in the street." Naiche's jaw tightened, his fingers tracing the edge of his knife. "My people raid. Kill. I refuse. Elders say I betray." He paused, the fire's glow carving lines of pain across his face. Exile better than blood. Abigail saw the cost of his choice. 7 years of solitude, a man caught between worlds, neither Apache nor settler, just a ghost in the mountains. The blizzard's roar faded to a low moan, but the snow piled higher, locking them in. Abigail fed the fire, her arms aching from holding Mason, her mind racing. She'd been taught to fear men like Naiche, yet here he was, grinding pine needles for her son's lungs, his hands gentle as a breeze. She thought of Pine Ridge, the whispers of widows who remarried too soon, the scorn they faced. She was alone now, but not helpless, not with Mason to protect. "You learned this," she said, nodding at the herbs. "After your sister?" Naiche nodded, his voice barely above the fire's crackle. "Never want child die again." Hours passed, the night stretching like a taut bowstring. Mason's fever began to break, sweat beading on his tiny brow, his breathing less ragged. Abigail's relief was a quiet tide, but exhaustion clawed at her. Naiche watched, his silence a steady anchor. He boiled pine needle tea, its sharp scent filling the cabin, and showed her how to drape a cloth over Mason's chest to ease his congestion. "Breathe with steam," he said, demonstrating with a slow inhale. Abigail followed, her fear loosening as Mason's color returned. The storm outside was a beast, but inside, a fragile peace took root. Abigail shared her last bit of jerky, tearing it in half for Naiche. He hesitated, then took it, their fingers brushing, a fleeting connection in the firelight. They spoke in low tones, trading stories of loss, Thomas's dreams of a silver fortune, Naiche's village burned by soldiers. Each word built a bridge, shaky but real, across the chasm of their worlds. By dawn, the blizzard still raged, but Mason slept soundly, his chest rising evenly. Abigail looked at Naiche, his face etched with fatigue but calm. "You saved him," she said, her voice steady. Naiche shook his head. "You save him. I only help." The cabin held them close, a sanctuary against the storm, as 2 broken souls found something worth fighting for. The Colorado blizzard had locked Abigail and Naiche in a world of white, but within the cabin's rough walls, a new rhythm took hold, a fragile pulse of survival, stitched together by necessity. Dawn's light barely pierced the snow-packed windows, yet it revealed Mason's steady breathing, his tiny chest rising under the quilt Abigail had sewn before Thomas's death. Naiche's herbs had worked, the boy's fever was gone, his lungs clear. The storm still raged outside, a beast gnashing at the mountains, but inside, 2 strangers, bound by a shared fight, began to carve out a life. Abigail stirred the fire, its embers glowing like a promise. The woodpile was dwindling, a stark reminder of the winter's demands. She'd chopped her own logs since Thomas's death, her hands calloused from the axe, but the task was brutal alone. Naiche, sitting cross-legged by the hearth, sharpened his knife with a whetstone, its rhythmic scrape a quiet counterpoint to the wind's howl. His presence, once a threat, now felt like a shield. "Teach me," Abigail said, her voice firm despite the ache in her bones. "How to keep us alive out here." Naiche's dark eyes flicked up, studying her. "You already fight. Now, learn tools." He started with the fire, how to bank coals to last the night, how to split pine for quick heat versus oak for long burn. Abigail listened, her hands mimicking his as she stacked kindling with precision. The lessons were practical, born of the mountain's unforgiving code, but they carried a weight beyond survival. Each shared skill was a thread, weaving them closer. Naiche showed her how to check traps he'd set before the storm, hidden in the pines, where rabbits and grouse might still roam. "Move quietly," he said, guiding her through the snow-choked clearing, his moccasins silent where her boots crunched. She learned fast, her stubbornness a match for the cold. Mason's gurgles filled the cabin, a sound that warmed Abigail more than the fire. Naiche, too, softened at the boy's voice, his guarded face breaking into a rare half-smile when Mason grabbed his finger. "He's strong," Naiche said, his English rough, but warm, like mother. Abigail's chest tightened, not with grief, but with something new, a flicker of hope. She'd been alone since Thomas's murder, facing a winter that could kill. But Naiche's presence changed the odds. If you're moved by their fight to survive, consider subscribing to our channel. It helps us share stories of grit and heart like this one, straight from the mountains. Days blurred into weeks, the blizzard unrelenting. Abigail learned to read the snow's patterns, spotting where drifts hid danger or offered paths. Naiche taught her to shoot straighter, adjusting her grip on Thomas's rifle until her aim was as sharp as his. "Not for kill," he said, his voice low. "For protection." She nodded, thinking of the miners who'd framed Thomas, their lies staining the snow red. The rifle felt heavier now, not with fear, but purpose. Naiche, in turn, found himself drawn to the cabin's warmth, to Mason's laughter, to Abigail's quiet strength. 7 years of exile had taught him to live without trust, but her willingness to learn chipped away at his walls. They shared meals, thin stews of dried venison, and roots, stretched to last. Over the fire, stories emerged. Abigail spoke of Thomas's dreams, of panning silver in streams that sparkled like hope. Naiche told of his village, of nights under stars, before soldiers burned it to ash. Their losses, though different, wove a common thread, grief that had hardened them, yet left room for something more. Abigail watched Naiche cradle Mason, his large hands gentle as he hummed a low Apache lullaby, and saw a man who'd chosen honor over violence, exile over blood. The woodpile shrank, and Naiche ventured into the storm to fell a pine, his axe bites muffled by the snow. Abigail joined him, her breath clouding as she hauled logs, her body stronger with each day. They worked as a team, their movements synchronized, a silent understanding growing. One night, as the wind quieted to a low moan, Abigail showed Naiche Thomas's old map, its edges worn from dreams of untapped silver veins. "He believed in this place," she said. Naiche traced the map's lines, his fingers pausing. "You stay for him?" She shook her head. "For Mason. For me." He nodded, understanding the weight of choosing life over memory. By the time the storm's grip loosened, the cabin was more than shelter. It was a home, forged in shared labor and quiet trust. Mason grew stronger, his eyes bright as he reached for Naiche's knife sheath, babbling sounds that promised words. Abigail and Naiche, once divided by fear, now stood side by side, their partnership a defiance of the mountain's cruelty. The snow still fell, but its menace faded, replaced by the warmth of three souls finding their place. Winter wasn't done, but they were ready. Together, they'd face whatever came next. The snow's menace had faded, leaving the Colorado mountains bathed in the tentative light of early spring, 1873. Abigail and Naiche stood stronger together, their bond forged in the cabin's fire-lit nights, a testament to survival against winter's cruelty. Mason's laughter, bright as a mountain stream, filled their days, but the melting snow uncovered more than green slopes. It brought the past roaring back, sharp and deadly as a rattlesnake's strike. Abigail knelt by the creek, washing Mason's swaddling cloths, her hands red from the icy water. Naiche was out checking traps, his silhouette a familiar shadow among the pines. The air carried a new warmth, but a prickle on her neck made her pause. Hoofbeats, faint at first, grew into a low thunder. She straightened, drying her hands on her apron, and reached for the rifle leaning against a rock. Two riders emerged from the trail below, their faces hard under battered hats. Abigail's gut twisted. She knew those faces. Jake and Carl Peterson, the miners who'd gunned down Thomas, their lie about Apache horse thieves, a blade that still cut deep. The brothers dismounted, their boots crunching on the thawing ground. Jake's smile was a crooked scar, his eyes glinting with malice. "Well, look at this, Carl. Widow Monroe, all alone out here." His voice dripped like rancid oil. Carl spat into the dirt, his hand resting on the pistol at his hip. "Not so alone, I hear. Folks say you got an Injun keeping you company." Abigail's grip tightened on the rifle, her heart pounding like a war drum. They weren't here to check on her. They'd come to silence the truth about Thomas's murder. Naiche's shadow moved through the trees, silent as a hawk's glide. He'd spotted the riders from the ridge, their postures screaming trouble. His knife was in hand, his bow slung across his back, but he stayed hidden, reading the scene. Abigail's stance, rigid, rifle ready, told him she'd fight. He'd taught her to shoot, to stand her ground. But these men were killers, and Mason was inside the cabin, unguarded. Naiche's exile had made him a ghost, but he wouldn't let Abigail face this alone. "You've got no business here," Abigail said, her voice steady as iron despite the fear clawing her chest. "Get off my land." Jake laughed, a sound like gravel underfoot. "Your land? With what? That half-breed brat and a savage for a guard dog?" Carl stepped closer, his hand twitching toward his gun. "We know you've been talking, girl, about Thomas, about us." Abigail's blood ran cold. They'd heard whispers in Pine Ridge about her questions about the shooting. She raised the rifle, its barrel steady. "I know what you did, and you'll answer for it." The air snapped taut, a bowstring ready to break. Carl lunged, drawing his pistol, but Abigail was faster. Her shot cracked through the clearing, grazing his shoulder. He cursed, stumbling back as Jake pulled his own gun. Naiche erupted from the trees, his knife flashing as he tackled Jake to the ground. The men grappled in the mud, fists and blades a blur. Abigail swung the rifle toward Carl, who was scrambling to his feet, blood soaking his sleeve. "Stay down!" she shouted, but he fired, the bullet splintering the cabin's wall inches from her. Naiche drove his knee into Jake's gut, pinning him, but Jake's fist caught his jaw, sending him sprawling. Abigail fired again, this time hitting Carl square in the chest. He dropped, eyes wide with shock, his gun clattering into the dirt. Jake roared, shoving Naiche off and lunging for his pistol. Abigail didn't hesitate. Her next shot tore through Jake's heart, and he crumpled, lifeless beside his brother. The silence that followed was heavier than the storm, broken only by Mason's faint cry from the cabin. Abigail's hands shook, the rifle slipping from her grip. Naiche rose, blood trickling from his lip, his eyes scanning her for wounds. "You hurt?" he asked, his voice rough. She shook her head, her breath ragged. "Mason!" she gasped, running inside. The boy was safe, fussing in his cradle, untouched by the violence outside. Naiche followed, his presence a steady anchor, as Abigail scooped Mason up, her heart still racing. She'd killed 2 men. Murderers, yes, but men. The weight of it settled like stones in her chest. Naiche dragged the bodies away from the cabin, hiding them in a gully where the spring runoff would keep them cold. "Others come," he said, wiping his knife clean. "Sheriff, town." Abigail nodded, her mind racing. Pine Ridge would hear of this. 2 dead miners, an Apache at her side. The truth about Thomas's murder was her shield, but it wouldn't stop the whispers, the hate. She looked at Naiche, his face bruised but resolute, and felt a surge of defiance. "We face it together," she said. He met her gaze, his nod a silent vow. The mountains loomed, their shadows long, but Abigail and Naiche stood ready, their bond forged in blood and trust, as spring's first warmth promised battles yet to come. Spring's warmth crept over the Colorado mountains, thawing the streams and bearing the scars of a brutal winter. But Abigail and Naiche knew the real storm was coming, not from the sky, but from the men riding up the trail. The bodies of Jake and Carl Peterson lay hidden in the gully, their blood a secret only the mountains kept. Yet the truth of their deaths hung like gunpowder in the air. Abigail stood on the cabin's porch, Mason in her arms, Naiche at her side, their defiance a silent vow as hoofbeats echoed closer, heralding judgment from Pine Ridge. 3 riders crested the ridge, their silhouettes sharp against the morning sun of 1873. Sheriff Morrison led, his weathered face grim under a wide-brimmed hat, flanked by 2 townsmen, Eli Carter, a storekeeper with a nervous tic, and Amos Reed, a preacher whose eyes burned with zeal. Abigail's grip tightened on Mason, his warmth grounding her as the men dismounted, their boots stirring dust on the thawed ground. Morrison's gaze locked on Naiche, his hand hovering near his revolver. "Mrs. Monroe," he called, voice steady but edged with caution. "Heard you had trouble. Came to see you're safe." Abigail stepped forward, her chin high, the rifle within reach inside the door. "Safe as I can be, Sheriff, thanks to him." She nodded at Naiche, whose stance was calm but coiled, like a wolf ready to spring. Morrison's eyes narrowed, flicking between her and the Apache. Folks in town heard shots, talk of 2 miners gone missing, Jake and Carl Peterson. Amos spat into the dirt, his voice sharp as a whip. "And now you're keeping company with an Injun. Ain't right, widow or no." Eli shifted, uneasy, his fingers twitching at his coat. "They came for me," Abigail said, her voice cutting like a blade. "Jake and Carl killed Thomas and blamed it on Apaches. They came to shut me up. I defended my home." Morrison's jaw tightened, his hand still near his gun. "That's a heavy claim, ma'am. Got proof?" Abigail's heart raced. She had no evidence, only the truth and the bodies Naiche had hidden. "My word," she said, "and his." She gestured to Naiche, who met the sheriff's gaze, unflinching. "They attack. She protects her son," Naiche said, his English rough but clear, each word heavy with conviction. Amos stepped closer, his face twisted with righteous fury. "You trust a savage over white men? You're a disgrace, living with him like this." Abigail's blood boiled, but she kept her voice even, cold as the creek. "This savage saved my boy's life when fever took him. What have you done but preach hate?" Eli coughed, glancing at Morrison, who raised a hand to silence the preacher. "Easy, Amos. I knew Thomas. Good man. If he was framed, that's a matter for the law." His eyes lingered on Naiche, calculating. "But an Apache and a widow together? Town won't take kindly to that. Naiche's hand rested on his knife, not a threat, but a reflex of a man who'd faced death too often. I stay to help. Not hurt, he said, his voice low, carrying the weight of 7 years' exile. Abigail felt the tension, thick as smoke, and stepped closer to him, Mason stirring in her arms. This is my home, Sheriff. My choices. Naiche's done nothing but good. Morrison's gaze softened, remembering Thomas's easy laugh, the way he'd shared a flask after a long patrol. I owe Thomas, he said quietly. But 2 dead men and an Apache here? That's trouble brewing. Amos muttered a prayer, his eyes boring into Naiche. Heathen's got no place among decent folk. Mark my words, this'll bring ruin. Abigail's temper flared, but she held Mason tighter, his warmth stealing her. Ruin's what men like you bring, Amos, with your poisoned tongues. Morrison shot the preacher a warning look, then turned to Abigail. I'll report what I see. Self-defense for now. But Pine Ridge won't let this lie. You're stirring a hornet's nest. He mounted his horse, Eli and Amos following, their glares heavy as lead. As the rider's dust settled, Abigail's knees trembled, but she stood tall. Naiche, a solid presence beside her. Mason babbled, oblivious to the storm of prejudice waiting beyond the mountains. They'll come again, Naiche said, his voice steady, eyes scanning the horizon. Abigail nodded, her jaw set. Let them. We've faced worse. The cabin stood as their fortress, its walls holding the trust they'd built through blood and fire. Spring's light warmed the porch, but the shadow of Pine Ridge loomed, promising a fight not just for survival, but for the right to define their family. Abigail looked at Naiche, his bruised face resolute, and knew they'd stand together, no matter what the town threw their way. The shadow of Pine Ridge's judgment hung over the cabin like a storm cloud, but Abigail and Naiche stood unbowed, their bond a shield against the world's scorn. Spring's warmth had settled into the Colorado mountains of 1873, painting the slopes with wildflowers and softening the earth underfoot. Mason's laughter, now 6 months strong, echoed from the porch, a beacon that drew them back to what mattered. As the sun dipped low, casting gold across the peaks, they faced a new challenge, not of survival, but of building a life that defied the hate waiting beyond their valley. Abigail sat by the creek, mending a tear in Naiche's buckskin shirt, her needle flashing in the fading light. Mason crawled nearby, tugging at the grass, his blue eyes bright with curiosity. Naiche returned from the ridge, a brace of rabbits slung over his shoulder, his stride easy but alert. The town's whispers hadn't reached them again, but the silence felt like a held breath, ready to break. He dropped the game by the fire pit, his gaze settling on Abigail. You think on them, he said, not a question, his English carrying the weight of their shared stand against the sheriff. She nodded, setting the needle aside. They'll talk. Call us what they want. Outcasts, traitors. But this, she gestured to Mason. The cabin, the mountains, this is ours. Naiche knelt, cleaning a rabbit with precise cuts, his knife glinting like a star. They hate what they don't know, he said. Apache, white, same fear. His words stirred memories of his exile, the elder's scorn when he'd refused to raid. But Abigail's defiance kindled something new in him, a vision of a home, not just a shelter. They worked together as dusk fell, Abigail skinning the rabbits, while Naiche built the fire. Their movements a quiet dance born of months in the storm's grip. Mason babbled, his tiny hands reaching for Naiche's knife sheath, and the warrior paused, lifting the boy with a gentleness that belied his scars. He called me, Naiche said, his voice soft, almost disbelieving. Abigail's heart caught. Mason's first word, Papa had come days ago, aimed at Naiche with a gummy smile. She'd seen the flicker in Naiche's eyes, a crack in his guarded heart, and knew what it meant to a man who'd walked alone for 7 years. Inside, they ate by the fire, the rabbit stew rich with wild onions Abigail had foraged. The cabin smelled of smoke and earth, its walls a testament to their labor. Logs reinforced, chinks patched against the coming winter. They spoke of plans, a bigger garden come summer, a smokehouse for meat, a cradle for Mason when he outgrew his current one. But beneath the practical talk ran a deeper current. Abigail traced the edge of Thomas's old map, still tucked in her trunk. "He'd want this," she said, her voice steady. "A life for Mason, not just dreams of silver." Naiche met her gaze, his dark eyes intense. "You give him that. We give him that." The word "we" hung between them, heavy as the mountains. Naiche set his bowl down, his hands resting on his knees. "I stay," he said, the words deliberate, like stones placed in a river. "Not just winter. Always." Abigail's breath caught. She'd felt it growing, this pull between them, not the fire of her youth with Thomas, but a steady flame, built on shared scars and quiet nights. "They'll hate us for it," she said, her voice low, testing his resolve. Naiche's jaw tightened. "Let them. Mason needs a father. I need." He faltered, English failing him, but his eyes spoke of family, of purpose found in their unlikely trio. Abigail stood, crossing to him, Mason asleep in the cradle between them. "I want it too," she said, her hand brushing his, a touch that felt like a vow. The firelight danced on their faces, casting shadows that merged with the night. They didn't speak of love, not yet. It was too raw, too vast for words. But it was there, in the way Naiche checked the cabin's bolts each night, in Abigail's care when she bandaged his wounds from the fight. They were building something, not just a home, but a family, defined by choice, not blood. Outside, the sunset bled red across the peaks, a reminder of the world's beauty and its dangers. Abigail and Naiche sat on the porch, Mason's soft snores drifting through the open door. They planned for the future, fences to keep wolves at bay, a trapline to expand. But their eyes kept meeting, holding a truth neither could deny. The town's hate would come, maybe with guns, maybe with words. But they'd face it as they had the storm, the fever, the killers. Together, they were unbreakable, their roots sinking deep into the mountain earth, ready for whatever spring's light would reveal. Spring's promise had rooted deep in the Colorado mountains, where Abigail, Naiche, and Mason had carved a family from the raw earth of trust and defiance. The sunsets of 1873 painted their valley gold, but the threat of Pine Ridge's scorn lingered like smoke on the wind. As they stood on the cabin's porch, their bond unbreakable, a new challenge loomed, not the violence of men or the cruelty of winter, but the quiet work of forging a future in a world that would never fully accept them. Abigail leaned against the porch rail, her hands rough from planting a garden that would feed them through summer. Mason, now sturdy at 6 months, toddled in the dirt, chasing a stick Naiche had carved into a crude horse. Naiche knelt beside him, guiding the boy's tiny fingers to grip the toy, his low Apache lullaby blending with the evening breeze. The mountains stood sentinel around them, their peaks jagged against a sky streaked with fire. Abigail watched Naiche, his face softened by Mason's giggle, and felt the weight of their choice to build a life together, not just for survival, but for something enduring. The cabin had grown under their hands. They'd added a lean-to for storage, reinforced the roof against next winter's snows, and dug a root cellar where the earth stayed cool. Abigail had learned to cure hides, her stitches tight as Naiche's own, while he'd taken to repairing Thomas's old tools, their edges sharp again for the work ahead. But their labor wasn't just for shelter. It was for Mason, for the promise of a boy who'd grow strong in these mountains, free from the hate that had killed his father. One evening, as stars pricked the sky, Abigail unrolled Thomas's map across the table, its lines faded, but still holding his dreams of silver. "We could try," she said, her voice steady, pointing to a creek marked in charcoal. "Not for wealth, but for him." Naiche studied the map, his fingers tracing the ridges he'd walked in exile. "Silver hard to find," he said, his English smoother now, shaped by months of talking with her. "But we hunt, build, live." His eyes met hers, and she saw it. A shared vision of a life carved from the land, not its riches. The next day, they scouted the creek, Naiche teaching Abigail to read the water's flow for signs of ore. Mason rode in a sling on her back, his babbling a soft rhythm as they sifted gravel. They found no silver, only quartz glinting like fool's gold. But the work felt right, a step toward a future they'd define. Back at the cabin, Naiche whittled a new toy for Mason, a hawk with wings spread, while Abigail baked cornbread from their dwindling flour. "He'll need stories," she said, watching Mason clutch the hawk. "About Thomas, about you." Naiche nodded, his knife pausing. "Truth, 2 fathers, one give life, one gives home." Their nights grew softer, the firelight casting a glow over shared meals and quiet plans. Abigail taught Naiche to read a few words from Thomas's Bible, its pages worn from her reading through lonely months. He taught her Apache names for the stars, pointing to constellations above the pines. Their differences, her settler roots, his warrior's past, faded in the face of what they built. A family stitched together by choice, stronger than blood. Yet the world beyond their valley waited, its prejudice a coiled snake. One morning, a lone rider appeared, not a threat, but a traitor from a distant camp, bartering furs for supplies. He eyed Naiche warily but spoke no hate, only news. Pine Ridge buzzed with rumors of the widow and the Apache, some calling for justice, others whispering of respect for her stand. "You're a story now," the traitor said, his voice rough as gravel. Abigail's jaw tightened, but Naiche's hand on her shoulder steadied her. "Let them talk," he said. "We live for us." The traitor left with a nod, and Abigail felt a spark of pride. They were a story, one of grit and heart, not shame. As summer loomed, they prepared for harder days. Wolves prowling closer, the garden needing tending, the cabin demanding upkeep. Abigail and Naiche moved as one, their trust a bedrock beneath Mason's laughter. The boy's first steps came under the pines, his hands reaching for both of them, his voice testing new words. "Papa," he said again, grinning at Naiche, and Abigail's eyes stung, not with grief, but with the weight of what they'd forged. The mountains watched, silent and eternal, as 3 souls claimed their place. The world's judgment would come, but in the cabin's glow, they were a family, unyielding, whole, and ready for whatever lay ahead. The tale of Abigail, Naiche, and Mason weaves a powerful thread of courage, trust, and family forged against the odds in the Colorado mountains of 1873. Their defiance of prejudice and pain speaks to the heart of resilience. What did their journey stir in you? Share your thoughts. Your reflections keep these stories alive. We're grateful for your time for joining us in this rugged tale of hope. Until the next story pulls you back to the wilds, stay curious and keep the fire burning. We'll meet again under these mountain stars.